My name is Anne Hackenbroich. I'm the Vindolanda's Digitization Project Officer. Thank you very much for joining us today for actually the last lecture in this series. This lecture series is part of an online exhibition, Digging Up Memories. So if you haven't seen it yet, please head to the Vindolanda website after the talk. Thank you very much, Barbara, for joining us today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce Barbara a little bit. Barbara Birley started to work for the Vindolanda Trust in 1999. She is now the curator for the Vindolanda Trust, and she also oversees the Trust's education program as well as the volunteering program.
Thank you everyone for joining me tonight. And I hope that over the next kind of 40-45 minutes, you'll enjoy what is, for me, a very self-indulgent talk about how I got involved in my generally ongoing involvement with the Vindolanda wooden collection. I've called it Down the Rabbit Hole because when I first started out at Vindolanda, I've always been interested in small finds, and I wanted to research the artifacts that we have, but I never kind of thought in my wildest dreams that I would be actually a Roman comb specialist, which is what some of tonight's talk is going to be about. But I've kind of given it a subtitle of connecting the wooden objects from excavations, which many of our volunteers or even people who come to visit the site see the wooden objects as they come out of the ground. So from the excavations to conservation, because I was lucky enough, as being the third and the last installment on our lecture program, to listen to some of the questions that people had through both Rob's talk, Rob Sansa's talk, and through Andrew's talk. And one of the questions that came up quite frequently was, how do we conserve these things? And then to research and understanding, which is my self-indulgent bit about talking about Roman combs. I've often said that I could probably bore people for hours about combs. I'm not going to do that tonight, but I'm going to talk about some of the salient points about how I really got interested and why I'm interested in them, which I think is very much in keeping with the digging deeper into our kind of Vindolanda collection and trying to bring out our memories and how we understand objects. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is talk about conservation first. So as I said, most people, if you've come to the site during the excavation season, maybe you've actually worked on the excavations in the pre-Hadrianic sort of layers of the site. I'm not going to be talking a huge amount about the excavations because you can actually watch Andrew's talk when it goes up on the website and find out about the wooden underworld and kind of the conditions that create the anaerobic oxygen-free layers. But I wanted to kind of put a couple of images of wooden objects up for you to see when they're actually still in the ground. So this was actually a wooden water pipe with the two junction blocks. All three pieces are made of oak. And then there's another object just to give you an idea and kind of be able to help you to think about what objects I'm actually talking about. This is the wooden toilet seat that was found a few years ago. Again, really muddy, thick. It wasn't found actually in a Roman toilet. It had been recycled and reused into a foundation on the site. Or even some of these objects. So we've got the wagon wheel with the excavators just there, or in the top photo, the wooden scoop that came out a few years ago, or even this Roman bowl. And so how do we take objects from a wet, muddy soil and turn them into objects like these? And kind of the story behind how that actually happens. We're very lucky at Vindolanda that we actually have on-site conservation. And this all started back in the 1970s when we started to really pull out quite a few organic objects. And the former curator, who is still very much part of the Vindolanda Trust, Patricia Birley, she was actually kind of our first conservation specialist on the site. And she worked with the British Museum in order to develop our conservation practices, and then has, in the practice of time, actually trained me on how to do the same processes. So these processes started back in the 1970s, and they really haven't changed too much in the interim. So on to the actual conservation. How do we do this process? So as you'll have seen from Andrew's talk, or maybe as a visit to the site, it starts out in these muddy, mucky sort of layers in the trenches. We get things like bath clogs, this lovely little kind of pot that you can see down there, or of course the hair combs. And I use a collection of rather simple tools. These are the tools that I use across the conservation, so both for metals and for the organic objects. I would never use a wire brush on say, a wooden object, but the toothbrush, especially if it's a big object, paintbrushes if they're more delicate objects, like the writing tablets. It's a fairly kind of straightforward but time-consuming process to slowly, the first process is removing that dirt and muck and mud. We also use these kind of modeling tools, of course, not on writing tablets, they're too delicate, but think back to those first images you saw, that big water pipe needed those types of tools in order to remove all of the mud and the muck. But our most important actual tool is water. And as you can see, this is Patricia working on one of the writing tablets. See, very delicate paintbrush that she's using, and water that just helps us to very slowly remove the mud and the muck. Quite a more simplistic process when you're dealing with something as small as a writing tablet or some of their other objects. Much more difficult when you've got something like that water pipe. And we had the kind of brilliant idea, I think, when we had that last water pipe come out, because we want to actually clean it and it's not going to fit in my sink. So we were able to take it to the little stream. So if you've visited Vindolanda, you know there's a stream that runs through the gardens, and we took it down to the stream. It was a lovely sunny day, and we were able to actually get the water flowing through the pipe, because the more muck and mud that we can remove from the object before it goes into chemical conservation, the better. So that's basically our first process, is get the dirt off. And then it does go through a chemical process, so basic wash. And then for our wooden objects, they enter into baths of methylated spirits and water, and it gets heavier and heavier on the methylated spirits as you go through, up to 100% meths. And then it goes into 2 baths of 100% ether. Then, of course, all of the objects have to then have the ether removed, and that's done by just air drying them. The idea is, if you think of a cell of a piece of wood, and what we're trying to do is remove the water from that object, and that helps to preserve it. Then all of the objects, except for the writing tablets, they don't get marked. Their packaging gets marked so that we know how to catalog them and where they come from, because for us, context and understanding where it relates back to the excavation is very, very important. It's transferred then to the storage facility and to go through its cataloging process. And we identify if it's a good object for display or if it should just go into storage. And it depends on the actual condition of the object. The small wooden objects, up to about the size of a bath clog, so about the size of a man's shoe, if you will, go through this chemical process. Anything bigger than that, for the most part, doesn't get chemical conservation. And that's basically because the chemicals are rather nasty. You don't want to have big baths of ether. There are other kind of chemical processes that you can use. People often say, well, something like that was done at the Mary Rose down in the south part of England. And yes, you can do that. It's very expensive and it's very time consuming. Those are baths of something called PEG. And it doesn't smell very nice. And it's, again, quite a nasty chemical. So we don't do that for our larger wooden objects. We actually do the basic wash, just like we would with the smaller objects. And then the object's wrapped in cling film. And this is checked and unwrapped every year and rewrapped in cling film. And it's a very, very, very slow drying out process. It can take up to 10 to 15 years. And this is actually the process that the wooden water pipe is actually going through. And a lot of the other big wooden timbers that you see on display at Vindolanda, that's actually what's happened to them. You can see in the picture there a picture of as we call it, the wooden underworld, and another set of water pipes just there underneath the ranging pole in the image. Now, this image is one from Rob Sand's talk a few weeks ago, back in October, but I've taken and slightly changed a few of the colors. But I think it's an excellent illustration of the percentages of the wooden collection that are of each wood type. Now, this has huge relevance on the conservation. And the reason for this is there's three things that have a huge impact on how an object will actually conserve. First of all, what kind of wood is it? And as you can see from the image here, that we have lots of oak, we have quite a bit of silver fir, lots of box, things like ash, and even all the way through to alder, we have quite a lot of it within the collection. And this has a huge, huge impact on how it will conserve, because oak, things like box that are very dense woods, conserve really well, whereas things like alder, a really wet wood that has quite kind of different cell structure, does not conserve as well. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. The other two things that have an impact on how well something will conserve is actually the condition of the wood and how it was used in the Roman period, of course, and then the condition and the preservation under the ground, and the conditions that happened when it was buried. So all three of those will have a huge impact on how an object actually conserves. I don't think that's a huge surprise to anyone, but those three things can actually have a huge impact. So as an example, I've got a couple examples here. This is a lovely little turned wood box. Of course, the muddy picture is as it came out of the ground. It was sealed. It had some black goopy bits in it when it came out. And you can see that it fits perfectly. When it went through conservation is the picture on the other side. You can see still looks like the same wooden box. If I probably tried really hard, I could probably get it to still seal, because there has been very little kind of shrinkage or expansion or kind of warping within the wood. So it's actually in really good condition. I would never try to actually push it back together, but it gives you a really good impression of something that conserved really well. Box does great, which also helps with our hair combs, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Other objects like this one, this is our grain scoop that came out a few years ago. Of course, in the picture on the one side, you've got it before conservation. So it's muddy, it's mucky, it's wet. And then you've got it on display in the case after conservation. And now this piece is made of alder and it hasn't conserved very well. And this is despite our best practices within the lab. And sometimes there's no kind of rhyme or reason to it. And every object has to be taken as its own case and very carefully looked at before we actually start that conservation process to try to help us to conserve it as best we can. So in reality, the really lovely little boxwood box is much easier for us to actually work with than something like this grain scoop. The other problem with the grain scoop is it is quite big. So you know, those things all come into play when we're actually working with the objects. So why is this all important? So that's basically the process of conservation. And how did we get started onto this project, and why am I sitting here doing this lecture? Well, the Vindolanda Trust is very lucky in that it's got what's called a designated collection. And anyone who knows me knows that I will stand up on my soapbox and talk about what does it mean to be a designated collection in the UK. Well, we have the Arts Council that oversees kind of in England, the actual kind of museum collections. And everyone has to be accredited if you want to kind of get access to the proper standards and everything else. We have a collection at this point in time that was up to Spectrum standards, which is the standard in the UK, which means that all of our cataloging processes are kept to the best possible sort of level. But there's a small number of collections, about 150 of them in the UK, and it's not museums, it's collections, so it can be sub-collections of bigger collections that are called designated. And that means they're of national importance, they're of outstanding quality, and that they're actively researched. And back in 2016, the Vindolanda Trust was able to apply, and it's not a simple process, and get designated status, which means that, of course, the collection are those three things. And I do truly believe that, in my own person. Hopefully, if you've been involved with Vindolanda and you've seen our collection, you would agree with me that it is an amazing collection. And so I had the opportunity, because of we being a designated collection, to apply to the Arts Council for their designated development fund. And we put together an application about digitizing Vindolanda's wooden collection. And it's to help with research. So people like Rob from the Sands from the University College Dublin come to me all of the time and say, right, we'd like to research part of your collection. And it can be anything from a broad sort of question about the collection to more narrow questions that they're looking at as part of a bigger project. And it's my job as curator to kind of go through and find and answer the questions that they have for me. Sometimes, and before this current project, that used to take me quite a lot of time. And we wanted to digitize our collection so that we could help to facilitate this research for our international audience of specialists. And with Annika's help, as she's our project officer, what we've developed is a database that helps us to find out lots of different information. And this is just a really simple screenshot of that database. And this is about a wooden bath clog that's in the collection. We can tell things like where it actually is in its location on the site that it was found, but also where it actually is within the collection. So this one happens to be on display in the wooden underworld, in the Romans in the home case. But as we kind of can fold out this longer sort of list of information, we can find out how big it is. We can find out it's all of its internal information, what kind of wood it's made of, which is really helpful for specialists when they're looking at the objects. Of course, this information was all recorded beforehand, but it took me or one of my volunteers a lot of time to find that information. And so through this project, we have developed not only the online exhibition, but this working database that is just almost finished. And so we're really excited about this. The project was hugely impacted by COVID. We saved a bit of money and we thought, right, how can we engage with people when they can't actually engage with our collection? They can't physically engage with our collection. And we wanted to try out some community engagement, and we were really interested in talking to the people that we could get to the site and that did have a vested interest in the actual collection. And so we developed the Digging Up Memories exhibition, and that's the online exhibition that is the basis behind doing all three of these lectures, but also looking at you know, the kind of wider sort of collection. We asked our volunteers, our staff, and some of our trustees to actually pick their favorite wooden object. Now, combs, which we'll go on to in just a minute, were very popular. Three of our kind of participants actually chose combs. So I didn't choose combs, despite the fact that I've spent a lot of time thinking about them. As my favorite object, I chose another object, which is a small turned object, which you'll have to go onto the exhibition to actually see yourself. But I decided that tonight, because I had this kind of time and space to be super self-indulgent and talk about combs, because they are in general one of my favorite objects, and actually tell you why I think they're fascinating. So without further ado, when I started looking at combs, there were some beautiful combs. I thought these are nice objects. They're interesting. And this was one of my favorites. It's a lovely little boxwood comb. All of our combs that I'll basically be talking about tonight are made from common box. They don't probably come from the local area. They're probably imported, but this one is a lovely object. It's got its little carrying case, leather carrying case with it. Or this one, which is, again, a very nice little object. It's got a graffiti across the center with Curator, who is presumably the owner of the comb. Unfortunately, we don't really understand what the rest of the inscription means because it's kind of an abbreviated inscription. And up until about 2013, that was kind of my interest in combs. It was making sure that they were safe and looked after within the collection, and just kind of leaving them at that point in time. They had a nice interpretation with them for the museum display. But it all changed with this comb here. We were having, in 2013, an advanced archaeological illustration course at Vindolanda. And we did these courses. We still do archaeological illustration, so people can come in and actually learn the process of illustration. And we always have to have a member of staff that is there to look after the objects with the people that are doing the courses. And so I came in and I thought, right, I'm going to try to draw a comb because they're interesting, and we'll see where we go from there. I sat down and the illustrator, the instructor says, first thing you do is take a really good look at this object. And that's the first step in doing any archaeological illustration. Spend about 5 minutes and really look at the details so that you know what you're going to draw. And I thought, right, it's a comb. It's got spiky bits on both sides, you know, they're different on both sides. And I started to look a little bit closer and I found this stamp. And you can see it just there on the bottom comb once you start to look at it. And I thought, I'd never noticed that before. Do other combs within our collection have stamps? What can this tell us? Is it the maker's mark? Can we go back and find out who actually made this comb? Are there other combs within the Roman Empire that, you know, we can link into and show that they were also made by the same person? I was really quite excited about this, and I thought, right, this is my first rabbit hole that I travel down, because I started to look and see if we could find other combs. We're going to come back to my rabbit holes in a moment, but I want to kind of look at why I wanted to study combs and kind of the general statistics about the Vindolanda collection, and then we'll get into the fun stuff. So in the last 51 years, we've excavated about 161 combs from the site. Most of them date to period 1 to 6 on the site, so circa 85 to 160. It is, as far as I can tell, the largest single site collection from the Roman Empire. I've looked at a lot of other collections from the continent, from Britain. I can't find a larger single site collection. To give you an idea, I went to the Museum of London, wanted to look at all of their Roman combs. They have about 30. So by a large stretch, it's larger than most other Roman collections. And then what can they tell us about who were using them on the site? The anatomy of the H-comb, it's a fairly straightforward sort of thing. They're called H-combs because you have the terminals on either side, which end up being the kind of uprights of your H, and a central bar that goes across the center. Usually this is where the decoration comes in, or the modifications. You've got guidelines, which are these lines that show where the teeth come down to. You've got coarse teeth and you've got fine teeth. It's a fairly straightforward sort of thing. It's not complicated. You do get different types of terminals and central bars. So here gives you just some of the examples from the Vindolanda collection. You've got what we call compass cut, which are actually cut on this curve, and they have kind of a rounded terminal. You've got fretted terminals, which are usually the most decorated. You've got D-shaped terminals, sinuous terminals, and what I call the plain or the flat, which means that it doesn't have much of a line on it. At Vindolanda, these are your statistics. So you get lots of sinuous, you get some D-shaped and flat, few compass cut, and only one fretted. The ones that are unknown are the ones that have been broken off at those H, kind of those uprights on the H, and so you don't get the terminals. So we don't know what their actual terminal shape would be. The central bars, we get a variety of different sort of decorative features on them. So we get the sunken cordon, which means that it kind of goes down and then comes back up for a cordon or a line that goes along the center. You get the raised cordon, which is the opposite. So it kind of comes out at you. You get the plain narrow and the plain wide, which, as you can see, they kind of say what they are on the package. I will say that the plain narrow tend to be a higher quality than the plain wide, and you can see that in the two examples there. The plain wide looks kind of like the cheap and cheerful, very quick, kind of less skilled crafts that's gone into it. You get the decorated. This one is fairly typical of the decorated sort of types that we get. You get this kind of chipped out sort of center bar, oftentimes in like a Z or an S sort of shape. Often you get this circle and circle pattern. And of course, as we have already mentioned, you get the ones that are stamped. Now, from the limited ones that we have within the collection that actually show a stamp, they usually tend to be the highest quality. So it's almost like the maker was only putting his name to the high quality actual objects. And as you can see, most of the ones that we have from the Vindolanda collection are fairly plain, but there are a number of decorated ones, with the sunken cordon and the raised cordon being the most popular after the plain. But just because they're plain doesn't mean that there's no sort of individualism to those combs, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So the production was my first rabbit, and see the little rabbit that's on our side of our screen. So this is the first of many holes that we're going to go down. You're going to follow me down as we look at the collection. So across the empire, most of the surviving combs are made of box. There are some that are made of bone, horn, ivory, or metal. By and large, these are high quality, especially in the period that we're talking about. So that kind of early first to second century sort of time period. You get more common bone ones in the later Roman period, but in the time period that we're looking at, most of them are made of box. They usually come from the waterlogged, oxygen reducing levels to very dry conditions across the empire. So like I said, Vindolanda is not the only place that finds them. That are found across the empire, but in much more limited numbers. Although box can grow in the British climate, the billets that are needed, the blanks that are needed in order to create a comb would require a tree of substantial size. And our climate here in Britain just won't actually allow that to happen. So the most likely place where these are imported from are places like the Mediterranean, including Greece, Asia Minor, northern Italy, and Spain. Boxwood is best worked when green, and so the transport of raw materials over long distances is usually rather rare. And we do have excavations from one production site in northern Italy where comb blanks have been found in different stages. And it's really interesting because this helps us understand the process in which they've been made. And also it's interesting because it's a boxwood production site. It's not a comb production site. So they're making and working other things in box, suggesting that combs weren't I'm not saying there weren't a specialist sort of craft, but that it's a kind of wider sort of working with box was the specialism instead of necessarily just making combs. So this is an image from the wooden combs from the Roman fort of Vetchen by Dirks and Voss, Vetchen's in the Netherlands. And it shows an image from the site in Altrincham where it shows the kind of making of the comb. So it starts out in that very kind of angular rectangle, and they would slowly work it into that Lawson shape that is so common for the wooden hair combs. And I just thought that it was really useful to kind of see that. It would be lovely to be able to say that we had more than one kind of production site, but unfortunately, this is the only one that has been found. So next rabbit hole that we go down is who used the combs and for what purpose? The questions that were raised of, was it part of the woman's kind of kit, her mundus manibus, her toiletry box, or was it part of the grooming ritual for men? I've got a couple of images here. One is of a relative of the Emperor Nero from the recent exhibition down at the British Museum, and she's got fabulously styled hair. And one of my rabbit holes was I started to look at Roman women's hairstyles and how they were put together and the kind of experimental archaeology that goes into this. And I can tell you that some of the kind of big Flavian hairstyles that would take up the whole sort of, huge, monumental sorts of things, and the kind of forms that they would have to put into that and how it would be sewed in, definitely was works of art, no matter how you look at it. Or were they from men? So lovely image of the man himself, Hadrian. I often get told that the wooden hair combs look like beard combs that are used today. Well, we all know that Hadrian was the bearded emperor. I'm sure that that our combs could have been used for things like beards, or for, of course, men's hair. And for me, we started to look at the archaeological context for where these combs were being found, and we'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about my archaeological case study. But the results of this rabbit hole, I can tell you, was that I think that it's both. Of course, it's not just one person or the other, one sex or the other that's using it. There's a lot of information out there about sexing Roman finds, but I think that definitely Vindolanda, both men and women are using the combs. I'm often told that they look like knit combs. Yes, they do. This is my next rabbit hole. I'd never thought I would know so much about knits as I do after my research into Roman knits, Roman knit combs, and knit combs in general. One of the Digging Up Memories participants actually talks about the fact that they remind her of knit combs with her children, and I think it's very true. For me, I think it's a lot about knit management, and I started to look into kind of soldier conditions in the First World War and in the Napoleonic Wars, and there's a lot of information from much more modern times that shows that instead of knit eradication, it was very much about knit management. Picture, if you will, a barrack room with 7 other men. We also have evidence at Vindolanda that it's not just the men that are living in these barracks, it's the women, it's the children, it's the slaves, and it's kind of a huge kind of conglomeration of different people. And so I think that knits would have been a common sort of thing that was happening, and you would try to use the combs to help relieve some of that kind of itch you might have. There's also other scalp disorders, such as dandruff and other things that would have been alleviated by the use of the comb. So this is my next rabbit hole. I started looking into scalp disorders and found the statistic that close to 50% of the world's population now suffers from some sort of scalp disorder. And I think if you don't have your Head and Shoulders shampoo or whatever, something like a really good comb will help to alleviate some of those sort of itches. Of course, they had different bathing processes than we do today. But no matter how good a Roman bath is, you've also got to think about some of the bacteria that would have been shared within a Roman bathhouse. And so I think that actually being able to have the health and hygiene side of a comb would have been really, really important. But then, how do you know which comb is yours? So this is my next rabbit hole. Of course, looking at the different combs and the modifications and decorations that they were using. Here's just 3 examples from the collection, whether it be the raised cordon or the sunken cordon or some sort of fancy decoration. This would have helped you to be able to say, that is my comb. Nobody else actually gets to use it. And there's other ways that they would modify them as well. So like this one, it's got a hole drilled into the top of it. There are some people who believe that these were used for hanging the combs to have them seasoned after they'd been made. But I think if that was the result of it, and that was the reason for the holes, then all of them would have holes in them, whereas we don't have that many. But this type of modification makes a lot of sense to me. If you're on your way and you have to travel from, say, your barrack all the way to your bathhouse, a hole in your actual comb might mean that you can attach it to your strigil or some other part of your bathing sort of your wash bag. So it would have been able to come with you. And I think that's quite a nice sort of idea as well. There's other modifications. This is another comb that's in the Digging Up Memories. And this one I find fascinating. It's one of my favorites. So this started out life probably as a standard H comb. And for whatever reason, the Roman decided to take and remove the fine teeth on it. Possibly they broke and they were no longer useful, but it's still a beautiful object and probably cost a little bit of money. And so those have been filed off, and you could actually now use it as a decorative piece, maybe in a lady's hair. Maybe the woman asked the man to, a man to do it for her. She did it herself, that type of thing. And so that modification, it's that idea of recycling or reusing, which I think is becoming more and more popular in modern culture, that you don't just throw something away, have a look at it, see if it can still be used. And I think that was very popular with something that they'd spent a little bit of money on, and you wanted to keep it to being used. We have a number of objects that show that they've been graffitied. Some, like this one, is just a simple squiggle that says this one's mine. Or as we saw earlier, there's the one that's got the lovely name that's been graffitied on it. Graffiti is a very popular thing across all sorts of different objects in the Roman world, most commonly on Roman pottery. And it's a way to market, to say, this one is mine. There's also one of the combs in the collection, unfortunately, I don't have an image of it, that has kind of a cross-hatching pattern on it. And you kind of wonder, maybe somebody decided that they wanted to make those alterations to make it look like it was a more expensive comb than the kind of cheap comb that it actually was. And of course, then there's the stamps, which we've mentioned already, but I just wanted to say these are really fascinating. They're always on both sides of the comb. Like I said before, they're always really well-made, well-crafted combs, so that the maker only wanted to kind of put their name to that one, to the kind of high quality objects. But they're always on both sides, and they're always in the center of the comb. And of course, this is the one that I was talking about that was found back in 2003, but came to my notice in 2013. But I've saved kind of one of my favorites for last, and this happens to be the fretted comb. This is our most decorated comb from the collection. It's got the lovely terminals that look absolutely beautifully well crafted. It's got the circle and circle sort of decoration and that kind of notch decoration around the sides. It's got nice fine teeth on both the coarse and the fine. But the interesting thing about this is, I bring up the illustration, you'll see the copper alloy plaque that's in the center of it. This one actually shows on one side a soldier. You can see his helmet there and his shield, and probably a pilum or a throwing javelin in his hand. The back of it also has a recess, and I think that it probably would have also housed another plaque. These plaques are very, very thin, and as you can see from the feet, the bottom of the soldier, it's actually just degraded away. So the copper alloy that they're made from would survive better than the wood within archaeological context, but it is very thin. It's not the only fretted comb with a copper alloy plaque from the wall. This one, unfortunately, it's not the best picture of it, and I'm sorry about that, but this one's actually from Tully House, and you can go and see it at Tully House in their gallery there. It's got a very different scene. It's actually of a temple, and if you can kind of make out just there, that's one side of the temple, and then there's kind of the triangle for the roof, and it comes down just here, and there's actually a seated figure in the temple scene. A couple of years ago, when we were working at Vindolanda, here's another rabbit hole for us to go down, we found this. It's a little copper alloy plaque. It's in the same repoussé sort of style as the other ones. No comb with it, just the plaque. It shows a two-horse chariot race, but it is the exact same size, minus this kind of bit on the side that's been kind of broken off here. And I'm not saying that it's definitely couldn't be from something else, but I think, and I would like to look into this further, and it's kind of my next stages, my next rabbit hole to go down. So if anybody has collections that they know of that have these types of things in it, please do let me know. But I think that these could be an indicator of that sort of fretted type of comb, and I'd like to see if I can find any more of them. A small, quick archaeological case study. So back in 2013, we were working on the excavations, and we came down to this really interesting site in the extramural settlement outside of the fort. And I'm not going to go through a lot of the archaeological detail because I want to look at the finds that came out of it. But as you can see, there's a rectilinear sort of building just here, and there's a round house just here. So from looking at the finds from this area, you have over 80 shoes, men's, women's, children's, large cache of buried hazelnuts, animal bones, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, dogs and cats, lots of pre-Hadrianic pottery. It's from the pre-Hadrianic period, brooches, perfume bottles, hairpins, beads, wooden combs, and then of course a collection of writing equipment, so stylus pens, stylus tablets, ink pen, ink tablets, and also this fabulous coin of Nerva, which is one of our better kind of coins, so I thought I'd throw it in there for you. But from looking at the data from what's actually inside of these buildings, it says to me domestic space. Now you could say that the rectilinear building has a more Roman, quote unquote, Roman sort of style to it, and that the circular hut has a much more, quote unquote, native style. You have to be very careful with how you kind of broach these sort of kind of periods where there's contact with kind of native versus Romans or Romanization, those types of things. And I think that this is a lovely kind of symbol of where those cultures are coming together. There's a big question about what is actually native, and if you're talking about the native Britons or wherever the Roman troops are and where they're native to. So I think there's vernacular architectures that are coming in here, but I do think that this is showing a period where people are coming together. The red dots on this slide show where the actual 9 wooden hair combs come from. And you can see that they're both within the Roman structure, and they're also within the native structure. And so these are not just Roman objects, that these are objects that are open to anyone to buy. I think it's also interesting that there's the accidental loss, which is probably the ones that are inside the house, because you've got a bracken carpet floor that might kind of hide things that you can't quite see. And then I also think the ones that are outside in the little ditch, kind of the ones up here, are probably actually ones that have had intentional deposit, i.e. thrown out in the rubbish. So there's a lovely sort of look at this building and or buildings, and being able to say that they both used them as probably men, women, children. There's a diversity there, and that they're using them to do all of these things that I've been discussing in the previous slides. Last couple of slides here, we're almost finished. I wanted to this is my reminder to talk about, I'm amazed that these things survive at all. So they're small, they're delicate, they're had to survive in anaerobic conditions for us to find and then conserve. But even back in the Roman period, that these things didn't actually make it into a Roman fire. This would make a perfect fire lighter instead of just a discard into the rubbish. These things are very simple, and they would have just gone into the fire. So any wood that survives always amazes me. And this object has actually been burnt all along this kind of circle here. And I wonder if it was like a hot bit of piping or something that it's just kind of leant up against, and it's burned in that sort of interesting arc. But for me, that they survive it all is just truly amazing. And hopefully I've been able to share a little bit of that with you tonight. I wanted to just point out a few other sorts of types of combs that we either don't get or that are from the kind of wider empire. So this one at the top is the Modestina comb that is on display in the British Museum, and it is made of ivory. And I should say that we don't get them yet. So when Andrew, Marta, and Penny and all of our volunteers go up onto the excavations this year, this would be the type of thing I would love for you to find. So you can add it to your ever-growing list of wouldn't this be nice? But then I also wanted to bring out, I said that these combs were from a very specific point in time on the site, so that earlier periods on the site. We do get a couple of examples of later combs, and those are mostly made of bone. The complete comb here is also from the British Museum. It's made of bone and it's called a composite comb. And the two pictures here are of two small bone fragments that we have made of combs that come from those kind of 3rd, 4th century deposits. Composite combs go from the late Roman period all the way through definitely into the Anglo-Saxon and Viking period. So it's quite a common thing to find in medieval England and Europe as well. So I hope that you've enjoyed that. I hope that I've kind of raised a few questions. I'm going to leave this kind of up for just a few minutes because it gives you some links to some other things that you can find out about combs, including the 3 combs that are from our online exhibition and some articles that you might find interesting about the combs. So that's me finished. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.